In 7 minutes, everything would change. 7 minutes. That's all it took for a father's love to rewrite the rules of power, dignity, and justice on the high seas. But before we get to that jaw-dropping moment that left an entire luxury cruise speechless, let me ask you something. Have you ever been publicly humiliated in front of people who were supposed to be your peers? That moment when someone looks you dead in the eye and questions your very right to exist in a space. Have you felt that sting when someone questions whether you belong? That burning sensation in your chest when whispers turn into stares and stares turn into statements that cut deeper than any knife ever could? If you've nodded your head even once, then you need to hear this story. Because what happened on the luxury liner Celestial Opulence wasn't just about one woman's humiliation. It was about every single person who's ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin, their background, or someone else's narrow-minded assumptions. Hit that subscribe button right now if you believe in stories of resilience and justice, because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in standing up for what's right. Let me introduce you to Amara Zuberi. 26 years old, brilliant, elegant, and the daughter of one of the most powerful men in international finance. When Amara stepped onto that gleaming deck of Celestial Opulence, she carried herself with the grace of someone who'd been raised to believe the world was full of possibilities. Her father, Kwame Zuberi, had built an empire on the simple principle that excellence speaks louder than prejudice, or so they both believed. The Celestial Opulence wasn't just any cruise ship. This floating palace cost more per night than most people make in a year. Hand-polished teak decks, crystal chandeliers that cost more than luxury cars, and suites that redefined the meaning of opulence. This was where the elite came to escape reality, where money whispered and status spoke volumes. Amara had chosen this voyage as her personal retreat. After months of boardroom meetings, charity galas, and carrying the weight of her family's legacy on her shoulders, she deserved this escape. She packed her most elegant dresses, her favorite books, and most importantly, she packed her expectations of being treated with the same respect afforded to every other first-class passenger. But here's what they don't tell you about elite spaces. Money can buy you a ticket, but it can't buy you acceptance. Wealth can get you through the door, but it can't shield you from the poison that still runs through the veins of high society. The morning sun danced across the Atlantic as Amara prepared for what should have been a dream vacation. She'd chosen an ivory silk dress that perfectly balanced elegance with understated confidence. Her friend Nia McKenna, a successful attorney and trusted confidant, had joined her for the journey. Together, they represented everything that threatened certain people's comfortable assumptions about who deserved to occupy spaces of luxury. As the ship pulled away from port, conversations swirled through the grand lounges and dining halls. High society elites, celebrities, and dignitaries mingled effortlessly, each person wrapped in their own version of privilege. The atmosphere buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes when wealthy people gather to celebrate their wealth. But beneath the surface of champagne toasts and polite laughter, something else was stirring. Subtle glances. Hushed conversations that stopped when certain people walked by. The kind of microaggressions that people with money and manners have perfected into an art form. You see, discrimination in elite spaces doesn't come with pitchforks and burning crosses. It comes wrapped in designer clothing and delivered with the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. It's the raised eyebrow that questions your presence. It's the tone that suggests you must be someone's guest rather than someone who belongs. And that's exactly what Amara was about to discover in the most humiliating way possible. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her father was about to demonstrate exactly what happens when you underestimate the power of a man who spent his entire life turning obstacles into opportunities. Kwame Zuberi hadn't built his empire by backing down from fights. And when someone decided to make his daughter a target, they had no idea they were about to witness the fastest, most decisive act of justice the luxury cruise industry had ever seen. 7 minutes. That's all it would take to transform humiliation into vindication, to turn a moment of weakness into a demonstration of unstoppable strength. But first, Amara had to endure the kind of public shame that would have broken lesser spirits. She had to stand in that grand ballroom, surrounded by the glittering elite, and face the ugly truth about how quickly respect can evaporate when prejudice takes the wheel. Are you ready to witness what happens when dignity meets power, when love meets justice, and when 7 minutes become the catalyst for a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about standing up for what's right? To understand what happened next, you need to know exactly who Kwame Zuberi is and why underestimating his family was about to become the most expensive mistake anyone on that ship would ever make. Kwame didn't inherit his fortune, he built it from nothing. Starting with a single investment firm in his 20s, he'd grown his empire into a global financial powerhouse that moved markets with a single decision. The Zuberi Group controlled everything from real estate developments in Manhattan to technology startups in Silicon Valley. When Kwame spoke, Wall Street listened. When he invested, entire industries shifted. But money was never the endgame for Kwame. Power was his tool, not his master. He'd watched his own father work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, had seen his mother clean offices at night so he could afford college textbooks. Every dollar he earned, every deal he closed, every empire he built was a middle finger to everyone who'd ever told him that people like him didn't belong in boardrooms. His daughter Amara represented everything he'd fought for. She wasn't just his heir. She was his proof that excellence could transcend prejudice. Valedictorian at Harvard Business School, fluent in 4 languages, and already managing her own portfolio of philanthropic initiatives at 26. She carried the Zuberi name with the kind of grace that made enemies out of people who couldn't handle being outclassed. Meanwhile, on the celestial opulence, the facade of perfection was starting to crack. The ship's grand atrium showcased wealth in its most shameless form. Guests draped themselves in jewelry that cost more than most people's homes, sipped champagne that aged longer than some marriages, and spoke in the coded language of the ultra-rich. But wealth couldn't mask the uncomfortable truth brewing beneath the surface. Nia McKenna, Amara's closest friend since college, was no stranger to these dynamics. As one of the few black partners at a prestigious Manhattan law firm, she learned to read the room like a survival skill. The subtle shifts in conversation when she entered. The way certain people's smiles never quite reached their eyes. The questions that weren't really questions but barely disguised challenges to her credentials. "You notice how they keep looking at us?" Nia whispered to Amara as they stood near the ship's magnificent staircase. The crystal chandelier above them cast rainbows across the marble floors, but the beauty couldn't hide the tension crackling through the air. Amara had noticed. Of course she had. The lingering stares that lasted just a beat too long. The conversations that paused when she approached, then resumed in hushed tones after she passed. The way certain guests seemed surprised when she demonstrated her knowledge of wine, art, or international finance. "It's the same everywhere," Amara replied, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of frustration. "They can't reconcile our presence with their assumptions." The first real incident happened during the afternoon champagne reception. Amara was discussing sustainable investment strategies with a group of European financiers when one of them, a silver-haired man with the kind of confidence that comes from generations of inherited wealth, interrupted her mid-sentence. "How refreshing," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's so rare to find someone from your background who understands these complex market dynamics." The circle fell silent. Amara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd heard variations of this comment her entire professional life, but it never stopped feeling like a slap across the face. "My background includes degrees from Harvard and Oxford," she replied evenly. "I'd be happy to discuss my qualifications if you're interested in something more substantial than surface-level observations." The man's face flushed, but he recovered quickly. Of course. I simply meant, I know exactly what you meant." Amara cut him off, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. She excused herself from the group, leaving behind a wake of uncomfortable silence. Nia found her later on one of the ship's private balconies, staring out at the endless expanse of ocean. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and coral. "You handled that perfectly," Nia said, joining her at the railing. "Did I?" Amara's voice carried the weight of years of similar encounters. "Sometimes I wonder if being perfect is the trap. We have to be twice as good to get half the recognition, and even then, they find ways to diminish us. Your father would be proud of how you handled yourself." At the mention of her father, Amara's expression softened slightly. "He taught me that dignity isn't something they can take away unless you let them. But some days, the weight of constantly proving yourself becomes exhausting." What neither woman realized was that their conversation was being observed. From the deck above, several passengers had gathered, their whispered commentary growing bolder as the evening wore on. "I don't understand why they even allow those types in first class," one woman muttered to her companion. "This used to be such an exclusive experience." "Money talks, I suppose," came the reply. "Though I question where that money actually comes from." The poison was spreading, and the ship's crew was beginning to notice. Some staff members shifted uncomfortably when they overheard these conversations, while others seemed to absorb the toxicity like sponges, allowing it to influence their own behavior. By dinner time, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Amara and Nia were seated at a prime table in the ship's most exclusive restaurant, but the warmth of the afternoon had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. Conversations around them carried an edge that hadn't been there earlier. The maitre d', a thin man with nervous eyes, seemed to hover near their table more than others, as if anticipating problems. When Amara ordered the wine pairing with her meal, he double-checked her selection with the kind of scrutiny typically reserved for teenagers with fake IDs. "Are you certain about the 2015 Bordeaux?" he asked, his tone suggesting he doubted her ability to appreciate such an expensive selection. Amara's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Quite certain. I visited that vineyard personally when I was consulting on sustainable farming practices for luxury wine producers. Would you like me to discuss the terroir characteristics, or shall we proceed with the pairing?" The man retreated quickly, but the damage was done. The entire exchange had been witnessed by neighboring tables, and Amara could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down like a physical force. As the evening progressed, the microaggressions multiplied. The server who seemed surprised that Amara could navigate the extensive menu in fluent French. The guest who asked if she was really staying in the presidential suite. The couple who wondered aloud if the ship's standards were declining. Each incident was small enough to dismiss individually, but together they formed a crushing weight of disrespect that was building towards something explosive. Nia watched her friend's composure beginning to fray around the edges. "We can leave," she suggested quietly. "Go back to the suite, order room service, avoid the circus." But Amara shook her head. "Running away won't solve anything. If we retreat every time they make us uncomfortable, we'll spend our entire lives hiding." What she didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. The grand ballroom was being prepared for the evening's main event, a formal reception that would bring together every passenger in the ship's most luxurious setting. And in that glittering space, surrounded by crystal and gold, Amara was about to face the kind of humiliation that would test every lesson her father had ever taught her about dignity, strength, and never backing down from a fight. The stage was set. The players were in position. And in less than 2 hours, 7 minutes would change everything. The grand ballroom of celestial opulence was a monument to excess. Soaring ceilings stretched 30 feet high, adorned with chandeliers that contained more crystals than most jewelry stores. The floor was polished marble imported from Italian quarries, so reflective you could see your soul in it. Golden columns supported archways that framed floor-to-ceiling windows, offering breathtaking views of the star-filled ocean beyond. Tonight, this space housed the cruise's most exclusive event. A reception that brought together every first-class passenger for an evening of networking, champagne, and the kind of social positioning that only the ultra-wealthy truly understood. The air hummed with conversations in multiple languages, punctuated by the delicate clink of crystal glasses and the soft melodies of a string quartet positioned near the grand piano. Amara entered the ballroom wearing a midnight blue gown that had been custom designed by one of Milan's most sought-after couturiers. The dress hugged her curves perfectly while maintaining an air of sophisticated elegance that commanded attention without demanding it. Diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother caught the light as she moved, creating tiny sparkles that seemed to follow her across the room. She looked absolutely stunning. She belonged in this space. And that's exactly what certain people couldn't stand. For the first hour, everything proceeded smoothly. Amara mingled effortlessly, discussing everything from cryptocurrency trends to contemporary art with various guests. Her knowledge was impressive, her manner gracious, and her presence undeniably magnetic. She was everything these people claimed to value: intelligent, cultured, successful, and refined. But as the evening progressed, the undercurrents that had been building all day began to surface more boldly. It started near the champagne fountain, where a cluster of older passengers had gathered around the refreshment table. Their voices carried the particular brand of entitlement that comes from never having been challenged, never having been told no, and never having shared space with people they considered beneath them. The clientele has certainly changed. Since I first started sailing with this line, one woman remarked, her voice loud enough to carry but disguised as casual conversation. Standards aren't what they used to be, agreed her companion, a man whose red face suggested he'd been sampling the premium liquor selection all evening. Money can buy you a ticket, but it can't buy you class. Amara was standing less than 10 feet away, engaged in conversation with a tech entrepreneur about sustainable energy investments. She heard every word. Her back straightened almost imperceptibly, but she continued her discussion without missing a beat. That's when Richard Wellington III decided to make his move. Wellington was old money personified, inherited wealth stretching back 5 generations, connections that opened doors most people didn't even know existed, and the kind of arrogance that comes from never having to prove yourself to anyone. He'd been drinking steadily throughout the evening, and alcohol had loosened whatever minimal filter his upbringing had provided. He approached Amara's group with the swagger of a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions. The conversation naturally paused as he inserted himself into the circle, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic. "Fascinating discussion," he said, his words slightly slurred but his intent crystal clear. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised by the diversity of opinions on investment strategies these days." The tech entrepreneur looked uncomfortable. Others in the group began to sense the shift in atmosphere. The way conversations around them were starting to fade as people became aware that something was happening. Amara maintained her composure, but her friend Nia, who had been approaching from across the room, quickened her pace as she recognized the danger signs. "I find diverse perspectives lead to better outcomes," Amara replied smoothly, her voice carrying the same professional tone she'd maintained all evening. Wellington's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Diverse perspectives. How wonderfully progressive." He took a step closer, invading her personal space in a way that made several onlookers visibly uncomfortable. "Tell me, what makes you think you understand the complexities of high-level finance? I mean, really understand them?" The question hung in the air like poison gas. Everyone within earshot knew exactly what he was implying. This wasn't about credentials or experience or knowledge. This was about something much darker, much more fundamental. Amara's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "My Harvard MBA, my Oxford fellowship, and my track record of successful investments seem to qualify me adequately." "Harvard has certainly lowered their standards," Wellington sneered, emboldened by the alcohol and the audience. "I suppose they need to fill their diversity quotas somehow." The conversation around them died completely. The string quartet continued playing, but their music now seemed like a soundtrack to something ugly and inevitable. Guests throughout the ballroom began to notice the commotion, turning to watch what was unfolding near the champagne fountain. That's when Wellington delivered the blow that would change everything. "I'm not sure why someone like you would think you belong in a setting like this," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent space. "This is a place for people of refinement." People who understand tradition, heritage, proper breeding. Not for people who are just playing dress-up. The words hit Amara like a physical blow. Every conversation in the ballroom stopped. Every eye turned toward them. The humiliation was complete and total, a public questioning of her very right to exist in this space, delivered with the kind of cruelty that only comes from someone who believes they're untouchable. Amara's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her face burned with shame, anger, and something deeper, the accumulated weight of every similar slight she'd endured throughout her life. The childhood taunts, the college professors who questioned her admissions, the business meetings where she'd been mistaken for someone's assistant. For a moment that felt like an eternity, she stood frozen as every judgmental gaze in the room pressed down on her. Some faces showed shock, others embarrassment, and a few displayed the ugly satisfaction of people witnessing someone else's destruction. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Wellington stood there with a smug smile, clearly proud of his performance. The other guests waited to see how this would play out, whether she would crumble, whether she would retreat, whether she would prove his point by failing to belong. But Amara Zuberi was her father's daughter. She straightened to her full height, looked Wellington directly in the eyes, and spoke with a voice that carried across the entire ballroom. "I belong wherever I choose to be." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of generations. They carried the dignity of every person who'd been told they didn't belong and refused to accept that judgment. They carried the strength of a woman who had been raised to never back down from ignorance, no matter how well-dressed it came. Drop a comment if you've ever felt this way, if you've ever had someone question your right to occupy a space you've earned through your own merit and excellence. Wellington's face flushed deeper, his satisfaction turning to anger at her refusal to be diminished. "We'll see about that," he muttered, but his words were lost in the murmur of conversation slowly resuming around them. Amara had won this round, but she knew the victory was temporary. The damage was done. The humiliation was public. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered if her father would be proud of how she'd handled herself, or disappointed that she'd had to endure this at all. She had no idea that in exactly 7 minutes, that question would be answered in the most spectacular way imaginable. 3 decks above the ballroom, in the ship's most exclusive private study, Kwame Zuberi was concluding a conference call with investment partners in Tokyo when his secure phone buzzed with an urgent message. The text was from Nia McKenna, sent exactly 47 seconds after Wellington's public humiliation of his daughter. Incident in ballroom. Amara publicly disrespected. Racial discrimination. Immediate attention required. Kwame read the message twice, his expression shifting from calm concentration to something far more dangerous. The Tokyo call ended abruptly. "Gentlemen, we'll continue this tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made his business partners grateful they were on the other side of the Pacific. The clock on his mahogany desk read 9:23 p.m. By 9:30 p.m., everything would change. Kwame's fingers moved across his phone's keypad with surgical precision. The first call went to Marcus Chin, his head of acquisitions, who answered before the second ring despite the late hour. "Marcus, I need you to wake up the legal team. All of them. Now." "Sir, it's past midnight in New York. I don't care if it's past midnight on Mars. Get them on a conference call in 60 seconds. We're making an acquisition tonight." The second call went to his personal attorney, Sarah Kim, whose phone rang in her Manhattan penthouse. "Kwame, what's wrong? How quickly can we acquire a company whose stock is publicly traded?" "Depends on the size, the Celestial Cruise Lines. The parent company that owns this ship." Silence. "Then, you're on their ship right now. What happened?" "Someone made the mistake of disrespecting my daughter." "How long?" Sarah's mind raced through the legal requirements, the regulatory hurdles, the sheer complexity of what he was asking. "Under normal circumstances? Weeks, maybe months for a company that size." "These aren't normal circumstances. I'm not asking for normal. I'm asking for possible. If we can get emergency board approval, if we can bypass the usual waiting periods, if we can convince the current shareholders to accept a premium offer." She paused, calculating. "Maybe days. Maybe. Not days. Minutes. Kwame ended the call and immediately dialed another number. This one connected him to James Morrison, a former SEC commissioner who now worked exclusively for clients who could afford to rewrite the rules of corporate acquisition. James, it's Kwame. I need to buy Celestial Cruise Lines. Tonight. That's not how corporate acquisitions work, Kwame. There are procedures, regulations. There are also emergency provisions for hostile takeovers when shareholders' interests are at stake. Find them. Use them. While these calls were happening, Kwame's personal team was mobilizing across 3 continents. His chief financial officer in London was pulling up Celestial Cruise Lines' financial records. His technology team in Silicon Valley was analyzing the company's stock position and ownership structure. His legal team in New York was researching every possible avenue for rapid acquisition. Most importantly, his personal assistant was making the one call that would make all of this possible. Good evening. This is calling on behalf of Mr. Kwame Zuberi. We need to speak with every major shareholder of Celestial Cruise Lines within the next 5 minutes. Yes, I know what time it is. Mr. Zuberi is prepared to offer 50% above current market value for immediate transfer of shares. The clock read 9:26 p.m. Celestial Cruise Lines was owned by a consortium of wealthy investors, most of whom had inherited their shares and treated them as passive income generators rather than active business interests. For people like this, the opportunity to make a massive profit on a stock they barely thought about was irresistible. The first shareholder, a trust fund heir in Monaco, accepted the offer within 30 seconds of hearing the price. The second, a real estate mogul in Dubai, took 60 seconds to consider before agreeing. The third, fourth, and fifth shareholders fell in line like dominoes, each call taking less time than the previous one as word spread through their exclusive network that Kwame Zuberi was offering an unprecedented premium for immediate sale. By 9:28 p.m., Kwame controlled 47% of Celestial Cruise Lines. The final piece came from an unexpected source. The ship's captain, a 30-year veteran of luxury cruises, owned a small percentage of company stock as part of his compensation package. When he received the call offering to triple his retirement fund, he didn't hesitate. At 9:29 p.m. and 34 seconds, Kwame Zuberi owned 51% of Celestial Cruise Lines. The acquisition was complete. 26 seconds later, the ship's intercom crackled to life. Back in the ballroom, conversations had resumed their normal rhythm. Amara stood near the windows, looking out at the ocean, trying to process what had just happened. Wellington had retreated to the bar, where he was holding court with other passengers, no doubt recounting his confrontation with the uppity young woman who thought she belonged among her betters. Nia approached Amara quietly. "Are you okay?" "I will be," Amara replied, though the hurt was still visible in her eyes. "I just need to—" The intercom interrupted her thought. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Please direct your attention to an important announcement regarding Celestial Opulence." Conversations paused throughout the ballroom. Guests looked up at the speakers, expecting some routine announcement about tomorrow's ports or weather conditions. Effective immediately, this vessel is now under new ownership. Celestial Opulence and its parent company, Celestial Cruise Lines, have been acquired by the Zuberi Group. The silence that followed was deafening. Wellington's whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward Amara, who stood frozen by the windows, her own shock evident on her face. The captain's voice continued, each word falling like a hammer blow. The acquisition was completed at 9:29 p.m. this evening. Mr. Kwame Zuberi, chairman and CEO of the Zuberi Group, is now the majority owner of this cruise line. We have been instructed to extend our full cooperation to ensure that all passengers receive the respect and dignity they deserve during their voyage. Guests began pulling out their phones, frantically searching for information about the Zuberi Group, about Kwame Zuberi, about the woman they had just witnessed being humiliated in their presence. What they found made their blood run cold. The Zuberi Group, $47 billion in assets. International investments spanning 6 continents. Owner: Kwame Zuberi, net worth estimated at $12 billion. Daughter: Amara Zuberi, Harvard MBA, Oxford Fellow, heir to one of the world's largest private fortunes. The woman they had watched being disrespected wasn't just wealthy, she was royalty in the world of international finance. And they had just witnessed someone publicly humiliate the daughter of a man who could buy and sell most of them without blinking. Wellington's face had gone completely white. He looked around the ballroom desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Other passengers who had participated in the whispered commentary throughout the day suddenly found themselves studying their shoes, their phones, anything that might help them avoid eye contact with the woman who now, quite literally, owned the ship they were standing on. The captain's final words sealed their fate. Mr. Zuberi has also requested that I inform all passengers that this acquisition was completed in response to an incident that occurred earlier this evening. He wishes to make it clear that discrimination of any kind will not be tolerated aboard any vessel under his ownership. Amara's shock began to transform into something else: pride, amazement, and a deep understanding of just how far her father would go to defend her honor. Hit that like button if you believe in standing up for family, because what Kwame Zuberi just did redefined the meaning of having your daughter's back. The ballroom remained silent as the implications sank in. In 7 minutes, a father's love had rewritten the power structure of their entire world. The woman they had dismissed, disrespected, and humiliated now held their fates in her hands. And somewhere in his private study, Kwame Zuberi was already making his next call, preparing to address the passengers who had just learned that underestimating his family was the most expensive mistake they would ever make. The clock read 9:30 p.m. 7 minutes had changed everything. The atmosphere aboard Celestial Opulence shifted like a seismic event. One moment, the ballroom buzzed with the casual arrogance of the ultra-wealthy. The next, it fell into a silence so profound you could hear the ocean waves against the whole 3 decks below. Wellington stood frozen near the shattered remains of his whiskey glass, his face cycling through shades of pale that had no names. The other passengers who had participated in the evening's casual cruelty found themselves experiencing something most had never felt before: genuine fear of consequences. But it was the transformation in Amara that truly commanded attention. The hurt and humiliation that had clouded her eyes just minutes earlier began to lift like morning fog. Her posture straightened not with defiance this time, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had just remembered exactly who she was. The daughter of Kwame Zuberi didn't need to prove her worth to anyone. Her father had just demonstrated her value to the entire world. Nia reached her first, her own shock evident in her voice. Did your father just buy the entire cruise line in 7 minutes? Amara's voice held a note of wonder. Yes, he did. The ballroom doors opened, and Kwame Zuberi entered with the measured stride of a man who had just rewritten the rules of power. He wore a midnight black suit that seemed to absorb light, and his presence commanded immediate attention from every person in the room. At 54, he carried himself with the kind of authority that comes not from titles or inherited position, but from having built an empire through intelligence, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept limitations. His eyes found Amara first, a silent communication passing between them that spoke of unconditional love and unshakable support. Then his gaze swept across the assembled passengers, taking inventory of everyone who had witnessed his daughter's humiliation. Good evening, he said, his voice carrying easily across the vast space without needing amplification. I believe introductions are in order. I am Kwame Zuberi, and as of tonight, I own this ship. The words weren't boastful or threatening. They were simply factual, delivered with the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. I received word that my daughter was subjected to treatment that falls far below the standards of respect and dignity that should define any civilized gathering. This presented me with a choice. I could accept this disrespect as the unfortunate cost of existing in your world, or I could ensure that such treatment never happens again aboard any vessel under my control. He paused, allowing his words to settle over the crowd like snow. I chose the latter. Wellington finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. Mr. Zuberi, I think there's been a misunderstanding. There has been no misunderstanding, Kwame cut him off, his tone remaining perfectly calm while somehow conveying absolute finality. "You question my daughter's right to exist in this space. You suggested that her presence diminished the quality of your experience. You reduced a Harvard MBA and Oxford fellow to crude stereotypes based solely on the color of her skin." Each word landed with surgical precision. Wellington's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Let me be clear about something," Kwame continued, his voice gaining strength. "My daughter doesn't need my wealth to validate her worth. She has earned her place in any room she chooses to enter through her own excellence. But tonight, I wanted to make certain that everyone in this room understands that disrespecting her comes with consequences that extend far beyond hurt feelings." The crowd remained motionless, hanging on every word. "This ship will continue to operate as a luxury cruise vessel. Your accommodations remain unchanged. Your dining reservations are still valid. Your shore excursions will proceed as planned. The only difference is that from this moment forward, every passenger and crew member aboard this vessel will be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of their background, their heritage, or anyone's narrow-minded assumptions about who belongs where." Staff members throughout the room exchanged glances that mixed relief with amazement. Many of them had witnessed discrimination aboard luxury vessels before, but they had never seen it addressed so decisively. Maria Santos, the head of housekeeping who had cleaned Wellington's suite earlier that day while enduring his condescending comments about those people, felt tears forming in her eyes. For 20 years, she had bitten her tongue while entitled passengers treated her as invisible. Tonight, someone had stood up not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than human by people with more money than decency. The cruise director, a polished professional who had spent his career managing the egos of the ultra-wealthy, found himself reconsidering every policy that had prioritized the comfort of prejudiced passengers over basic human dignity. Even among the passenger ranks, the transformation was visible. Those who had remained silent during Wellington's attack now looked ashamed of their inaction. Others, who had participated in the whispered commentary throughout the day, suddenly found themselves examining their own behavior with uncomfortable clarity. Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton, a society matron from Boston who had made several pointed observations about the changing demographics of luxury travel, approached Amara with obvious nervousness. "Miss Zuberi," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I owe you an apology. My comments earlier were inappropriate and racist. I have no excuse for my behavior." It was the first of many such apologies that would follow throughout the evening. Amara received each one with grace, though her responses varied based on the sincerity she detected. Some passengers genuinely seemed to understand the harm they had caused. Others appeared motivated primarily by fear of consequences now that they knew who owned their floating sanctuary. But it was her father's final words that truly transformed the atmosphere aboard celestial opulence. "Excellence has no color," Kwame declared, his voice rising to fill every corner of the ballroom. "Success requires no permission from those who mistake privilege for achievement. My daughter stands before you tonight not as a beneficiary of my wealth, but as a testament to what becomes possible when talent meets opportunity and refuses to be diminished by ignorance." He placed a protective hand on Amara's shoulder. "Tonight, we have all learned something valuable. Some of you have learned that actions have consequences. Others have learned that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. But most importantly, I hope you have learned that the true measure of luxury is not found in crystal chandeliers or marble floors. It is found in how we treat one another." The applause that followed started slowly, uncertainly, but grew until it filled the entire ballroom. It wasn't the polite applause of social obligation, but something deeper: recognition, respect, and for many, relief that someone had finally said what needed to be said. As the crowd began to disperse, conversations resumed throughout the ship, but they carried a different tone now. The casual cruelty that had marked the earlier part of the evening was replaced by more thoughtful exchanges. Passengers found themselves questioning assumptions they had never examined, considering perspectives they had never bothered to explore. The transformation was more than cosmetic. It reached into the very structure of social interaction aboard the vessel. Staff members walked taller, knowing they worked for someone who valued their dignity. Passengers engaged more respectfully with everyone they encountered, aware that their behavior was now subject to standards that actually meant something. Wellington himself had disappeared from the ballroom shortly after Kwame's speech, retreating to his suite where he would spend the remainder of the voyage in relative isolation, too humiliated to show his face in public spaces. But the real transformation was in Amara herself. The woman who had entered the ballroom earlier that evening carrying the weight of constant scrutiny now moved through the ship's corridors with the confidence of someone who had been publicly validated by the most powerful demonstration of support imaginable. Her father had done more than defend her honor. He had redefined the entire framework within which respect and dignity operated aboard celestial opulence. 3 days later, as celestial opulence prepared to dock at its final port, Amara stood on the ship's highest observation deck, watching the sunrise paint the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. The events of that first evening felt both distant and immediate, a watershed moment that had changed not just her crew's experience, but her understanding of her own power and place in the world. The transformation aboard the ship had been remarkable. Staff members greeted passengers with genuine warmth rather than the calculated politeness of service workers walking on eggshells. Conversations in the dining rooms carried more substance, more authenticity. The artificial barriers that had once divided passengers along unspoken lines of prejudice had crumbled, replaced by interactions based on shared humanity rather than assumed hierarchies. But the changes ran deeper than surface-level courtesy. Amara had received messages from passengers throughout the voyage, some offering apologies, others sharing their own stories of discrimination, and many expressing gratitude for having their perspectives challenged in such a direct way. A tech executive from Germany had confessed that watching her father's response had forced him to confront his own biases about who deserved seats at corporate boardroom tables. A socialite from New York admitted that she had spent years making assumptions about people based on appearances, and that witnessing Kwame's demonstration of power had opened her eyes to the brilliance she had dismissed. The ripple effects extended far beyond the ship itself. News of the acquisition had spread through financial networks, social media, and international news outlets. The story resonated with people around the world who had experienced similar moments of public humiliation, who had been told they didn't belong in spaces they had earned the right to occupy. Young Black professionals reached out through social media, sharing their own stories of boardroom discrimination and country club exclusion. Parents wrote to thank Kwame for showing their children what it looked like when excellence refused to be diminished by ignorance. Entrepreneurs spoke about feeling empowered to demand the respect their achievements warranted. But perhaps most importantly, the story had sparked conversations in elite circles about the casual racism that had been accepted as normal for far too long. Country clubs were reviewing their membership policies. Corporate boards were examining their diversity initiatives with new urgency. Luxury service providers were training their staff to recognize and address discriminatory behavior. The incident had become more than a personal vindication. It had become a catalyst for systemic change. As Amara reflected on these developments, her father joined her on the observation deck. For several minutes, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher into the morning sky. "Do you regret what happened?" Kwame asked finally. Amara considered the question carefully. "The humiliation was painful," she said slowly. "But what followed? I don't think I truly understood the weight of our family name until I saw what you were willing to do to defend it." "I didn't do it to defend our name," Kwame replied gently. "I did it to defend your dignity. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Sometimes I feel like I carry the expectations of everyone who looks like us, everyone who's been told they don't belong. It's exhausting." Kwame turned to face his daughter fully. "Excellence is indeed exhausting. But the alternative? Accepting limitations imposed by other people's ignorance is far worse. You don't carry those expectations because you have to. You carry them because you choose to. And that choice makes you powerful." Amara smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. "You taught me that dignity isn't something they can take unless you let them. This week, I learned that sometimes dignity requires backup. It requires family, Kwame corrected. It requires people who understand that when one of us is diminished, we are all diminished. And when one of us rises, we all have the opportunity to rise with them. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Amara had always known her father was powerful, but witnessing him wield that power in defense of her honor had revealed new dimensions of his love and commitment. She was no longer just the beneficiary of his success. She was his partner in ensuring that success translated into meaningful change. As passengers began disembarking later that morning, many approached Amara to share final thoughts. The apologies had evolved into commitments, promises to challenge discrimination in their own circles, to create more inclusive environments in their businesses, to raise their children with broader perspectives on who deserves respect. Wellington himself appeared briefly, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine shame. His apology was simple and direct, free of excuses or justifications. Amara accepted it graciously, understanding that his humiliation had been as transformative as her own vindication. If this story touched you, if you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you've earned the right to be, I need you to do 3 things right now. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of resilience and justice. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their dignity matters. And drop a comment telling us about a time when you or someone you know stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. The story of celestial opulence became more than entertainment. It became proof that change is possible when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Kwame Zuberi had demonstrated that power, when combined with principle, could rewrite the rules that had governed social interaction for generations. As the Zuberi family stepped onto solid ground, they carried with them not just the satisfaction of justice served, but the knowledge that their actions had created ripples of change extending far beyond their personal experience. They had shown the world that excellence demands respect, that dignity cannot be negotiated, and that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is the unwavering refusal to accept it. The legacy of those 7 minutes would endure long after the luxury cruise ended, inspiring others to demand the respect they deserved and proving that when we stand up for what's right, we create possibilities for everyone who follows.